this something that businesses should be concerned about? Could it potentially have a risk impact on them?
Yes, in a number of different ways. The killing of Osama bin Laden is something that America has been very driven towards over the last 10 years. And it's, so far as Al-Qaeda and terrorism around the globe it's really a symbolic action. We've seen over the last few years that Western governments, the UK, US and European have been very good at interdicting and breaking down the central Al-Qaeda structure. And it's operating much more now in sort of small lone cells around the continent, particularly in Africa, and also in franchises. So you've got Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and you've got Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, quite successful in what they're doing. So the killing of Osama bin Laden has a number of implications for risks to business. The first and foremost is that there's going to be a slight increase in demonstrations, and people who are supporters of Al-Qaeda, supporters of Osama bin Laden, are going to demonstrate, and those demonstrations are going to be probably around Western embassies and places of the flag, the government positions in countries. So far as terrorist attacks are concerned, there might be a slight increase in attacks in areas where the terrorist threat is quite high. So far as business is concerned, it's business as usual, but with a heightened level of security awareness. In the longer term, it may be that larger, spectacular attacks that are in planning might be accelerated so that it can feed off the back of his death. But generally, it's business as usual, and the terrorist threat remains credible. It remains extant in many countries around the continent, and businesses, particularly Western businesses, need to be aware and vigilant.
Well, you mentioned some of those cells in Africa, and we have seen attacks on US installations in the East Africa region in particular before. How about here in South Africa and Southern Africa? Do you think there is much of a threat down here?
No, I think that we saw coming into the World Cup, if you think back to the World Cup last year, a terrorist alert and a lot of work done by governments and the South African government to look at the threat, particularly from Al-Qaeda coming across the borders. The South African borders are quite porous, and there has been intelligence to suggest that there are small isolated cells operating, particularly in the Western Cape area. But we saw none of that manifest itself during the World Cup, and since then there's been very limited risks to business.
Because we have lots of South African businesses operating across the continent.
Exactly.
So if South African companies are present in countries like Kenya, like Tanzania, where you may have those cells, what would you be advising them to do at this stage?
Well, first and foremost, we're advising a review of their security procedures, and this is routine and should be done regularly anyway, ensuring that their security procedures are in place and are carried out effectively. If you're operating, your bases are close to, say, the US Embassy in Kenya, you might want to review travel plans and your senior management's movements over the next few days, particularly if their movements take them close to areas of Western prominence, so to speak. The only other sort of risk implications are if you're travelling to the US or travelling into the UK or Western Europe, you might find your travel disrupted slightly with an increased level of security awareness. I know the US government have sent out a message to all of its interests abroad to raise the level of security following the killing, just to be aware of potential uprising, potential being in the wrong place at the wrong time type events where people are looking for some way of avenging his death, but nothing sort of concrete or planned or spectacular.
Well, you mentioned the decentralization of Al-Qaeda over the past couple of decades, largely at the hands of the US and forces like that. Is it losing its influence globally? Is it less able to carry out these big attacks like 9/11?
Yes, it is, and we're seeing that. We're seeing a number of, and President Obama mentioned it yesterday in his speech, we're seeing a number of attacks being interdicted very early on in the planning stages. So the intelligence agencies have learned and have gone up that steep learning curve and are very good at interdicting these attacks at the planning stage. We're also seeing the coordinated effort at destroying the the central nervous system of the Al-Qaeda. So we've seen in Pakistan, where Al-Qaeda Central is based, is pretty much now focused on Pakistan, border region, and into Afghanistan. And you've seen Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb being prosecuted voraciously by the local governments in Mali and places like that, and also in the Arabian Peninsula. It has had an impact, but actually what's probably more pertinent is the Arabian Spring, the uprisings we've seen across North Africa and the Middle East, which has been away from the sort of teachings that Al-Qaeda's put through, a rebellion, violent uprisings against oppression, but it's been much more of a peaceful, looking at the more sort of traditional, living standards, the economy. And it's much more of a peaceful approach to this, and it seems to be a lot more successful. We've seen governments toppled on the back of a successful, peaceful uprising, rather than the sort of the Al-Qaeda doctrine of terrorist attacks.
David, you said that the death was quite a symbolic gesture. Is it likely that bin Laden will just be replaced at this stage? What's the feeling out there?
It's very difficult to replace him. I mean, he is, he's iconic in his charisma and his leadership, and he was behind what is the greatest attack in Al-Qaeda's terms on American soil. And so it's very difficult to replace that. And almost some people would say he's entered into retirement. In Pakistan, he has little influence in Al-Qaeda, the movement across the globe. So with it operating under the franchises and as small isolated cells being harried by Western intelligence services, it's very difficult to identify who might be the right person to step into his shoes. There are one or two potential candidates, but nobody with the same sort of credibility and gravitas that Osama bin Laden has in that movement.
In the meantime, the message to companies out there is business as usual, but be alert.
Be alert.